unavoidable decline in world oil production. And these revolutions could be controversial, disruptive, and even ugly. And they are happening because the world of oil is changing. And what this chart shows, if you just imagine the outside of this chart, it shows total world oil production from 1930 to 2050. And obviously the first part of it are actual data and the last part of it are projections. And you'll see that it peaks around 2010, a couple of years from now. And it's in layers. And let me deal with these layers in turn. The bottom layer, the green one, is US 48-state production of oil. And that peaked in 1970. Nobody has a greater need for oil than the United States. It uses a quarter, less than 5% of the world's population uses a quarter of the world's oil. It has the most sophisticated people and companies in the oil business. And yet, since 1970, it has not been able to keep production up to where it would like to be. Production has been inexorably falling since 1970. It was the first country to produce substantial amounts of oil and the first country to hit the peak in production, which is a consequence of the geology of oil-bearing strata. The second one shows Europe, chiefly the North Sea, and that peaked in 2001. And that is the second most sophisticated place in the world in terms of oil production and oil technology. And before I moved to Toronto 40 years ago this year, I lived in Aberdeen in Scotland, which is the centre of the oil industry in the UK. And I left it about 2 years before they discovered oil. My house, which I sold for £5,000, was 3 years later was worth £32,000. I felt damaged by the oil there, but the peak has passed, and it is inexorably going down. UK production is declining, Norwegian production is declining. Move to the next one, Russian oil. Russian oil is now declining, just of last year, the later part of last year. It's just about the biggest producer in the world now. It did have an earlier peak, and there was a glitch around the end of the USSR and so on, and the collapse of the economy, but the real peak is now entering. Other here are most of the remaining 60 or so countries in the world that have produced significant amounts of oil. And in all but about 10 of those, production has reached its peak and is declining. As I said before, it is a property of oil fields that they reach a peak in production and they then decline, and there's nothing much you can do about it. And the final one of what are normally called conventional oils are the Middle East, which has not yet reached a peak. It looks as though it might have reached a peak there, but it's actually the width of this part because they're sitting on top of each other. And it's not well known when that peak will be reached, but the best estimate is maybe during the next 10 years, possibly during the next 20 years. The data that are available publicly are very sparse. Now, above that Middle East band there, which is quite thick, you have a dark band, which is heavy oil, and it is mainly oil from Alberta. Two kinds of oil from Alberta, oil sands and the heavy oil from Lloydminster. And mainly the oil sands, increasingly the oil sands. And there are huge amounts of oil in the oil sands, absolutely huge amounts of oil, possibly more than in the whole of the Middle East. But what is key, and I must repeat this because it is the key point, what is key is not how much oil you have in the ground, but how much you can produce in any year. And even the most optimistic oil sands mavens do not believe that production could rise to more than double or possibly 3 times where it is now. And that's reflected in this band, this narrow band here, which shows that Alberta's contribution to world oil, which is now well under 5%, is not going to rise to more than 10 to 15%. It's going to be a minor part of the world scene, a major part of Canada's and to a lesser extent North America's scene. But it is, Alberta's oil is not going to save the world, and I'll come back to that. The next one above that is deep water oil, the thicker blue part, which is the biggest play at the moment, mainly very, very deep wells drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, often kilometers through the sea, and then kilometers more through the seabed. Similarly, off the coast of Brazil and off the west coast of Africa. The next one is polar, a very thin one, even though there's a lot of talk about a lot of oil coming out of the polar regions. The reality, both in the past and in the expected future, according to geologists, is a pretty thin line. And the last one is not really oil. It's what are called natural gas liquids, chiefly propane in your barbecues and butane in cigarette lighters, which you used to see a lot of. And these are liquid or almost liquid at room temperatures, and they play a significant role in the refining of oil. They make the heavier oils lighter, they make gasoline possible, and so on. And they count as oil more than as natural gas. They're pulled out of the natural gas stream and they're sent off to the oil refinery. And that's why they're there. And they've actually been keeping us going to a degree. So we have a situation where we are at, and there may be a year or two era here, or approaching the peak. And energy prices, oil prices have been going up. If you take a straight line, not a straight line projection, but if you just project the recent curve, you get that dashed line. Where will it stop? But today's price is actually there. Actually, it's Friday's price, but today's price is almost the same. It's even ahead, higher than the line. We're in a somewhat extraordinary situation. Not even the geologists who created the previous chart, who have known for years that we're reaching this point of the world peak in production. Not even they expected that it would happen quite so rapidly and produce quite such a big impact in price. And economists who might know better have hardly touched this matter. We're in unknown territory here. You see, when the United States reached its peak in 1970, it could continue to keep on using oil because it had other people's oil to use. It had oil from the Middle East, and oil from Algeria, and oil from Venezuela, and increasingly, lately, oil from Canada. And then, when other countries reached their peak, and I mentioned there are 50 or so that have, they could just, while their oil was declining, they could get oil from somebody else. But when the world reaches its peak, there isn't another planet from which we can get that oil to keep our production growing. And that's the situation we're in now. This is the top middle part of that last fancy graph that I showed you. Just going from 1990 to 2030. And I'm going to just show some things around that, which is why I've just selected that out. This line is the most authoritative estimate of world consumption if there were the oil to consume. The red line comes from the International Energy Agency. It was produced last November. And what it is, essentially, is a business-as-usual projection, more or less, and it just shows that if the oil is available, people will just keep on going up and up and up. The actors will change, not so much will be used in richer countries and more will be used in poorer countries.